The spotlight wasn't supposed to be on her. Not according to him. She had spent years standing in the background, unnoticed, unappreciated. He had made sure of it. Every time she stepped forward, eager to share an idea, he brushed her off with a half-hearted nod or a forced smile. When she spoke, he barely listened. When she worked twice as hard as everyone else, he took credit. And when she dared to dream bigger, to step beyond the limits he had drawn for her, he laughed. Not outright no, he was too careful for that. But the smirk, the condescending tone, the way he never truly acknowledged her talent, it was all the same. He had dismissed her. But now, the world was watching her. The stage lights glowed softly, casting long shadows across the packed auditorium. The energy in the room buzzed with anticipation. A name echoed through the speakers, her name, and the crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, flashes of cameras, it was overwhelming. Yet, she stood there, calm, poised, as if she had always known this moment would come. From his seat in the audience, he gripped the armrests, his jaw tight. He hadn't clapped. He couldn't. Something about seeing her up there, commanding the space, made his chest tighten with something he refused to name. He had been the one in control. The leader. The one people respected. She had just been there. Quiet, eager, persistent, but never someone he thought twice about. She was supposed to be a supporting role in the story, his story. But now, she was the one standing in the spotlight. And he was the one left in the dark. The first time he met her, he barely remembered it. She had come in with too much enthusiasm, too many ideas, too much belief that talent alone could get her somewhere. He knew better. Connections mattered. Status mattered. And people like her, they didn't make it to the top. Not unless someone like him decided they should. And he hadn't. She had worked under him for years, doing the kind of work that made others shine while she remained unseen. She didn't complain, didn't push too hard at least, not in a way that he couldn't dismiss. But he knew she wanted more. He had seen it in the way she stayed late, perfecting her craft. The way she watched every opportunity slip by, only to return the next day with that same quiet determination. It almost irritated him how she refused to break under the weight of being overlooked. Then, one day, she was gone. No announcement, no big farewell, just an empty desk where she used to be. He hadn't given it much thought. People came and went. She was talented, sure, but talent without the right support didn't mean much. He figured she'd end up somewhere small, maybe start something of her own, struggle like most do, and eventually fade into the background. But she hadn't faded. Instead, she had risen. At first, it was just whispers. Someone mentioned her name in passing. A new project, a fresh idea making waves. He barely listened. Then, the whispers grew louder. Articles, interviews, recognition. He started seeing her name everywhere. And then came the moment that made his stomach drop. She wasn't just doing well. She was outshining him. The same ideas he had once dismissed. Now, they were being praised as groundbreaking. The same skills he had overlooked. People were calling her a genius. The industry he had controlled for years now had a new star, and it wasn't him. And now, she was here, standing on that stage, accepting an award he had once believed would be his. The host handed her the microphone. The audience hushed. He leaned forward slightly, not even realizing he was holding his breath. She glanced at the crowd, a small smile playing at her lips. But then, for just a second, her eyes landed on him. She saw him. And in that moment, he knew she hadn't forgotten. She remembered every time he dismissed her. Every time he made her feel invisible. Every time he pretended her talent didn't matter. Now, she had the chance to say something. To acknowledge the journey, to thank the people who had supported her, or to call out the ones who hadn't. The silence stretched. Then she took a breath, lifted the mic to her lips, and spoke. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, a quiet strength, a sharp edge. "I never imagined I'd be standing here," she said, her fingers wrapped around the microphone. "Not because I didn't believe in myself, but because, for a long time, others didn't." The audience listened, hanging on to her every word. Cameras flashed, catching the moment. Somewhere in the back of the room, he clenched his fists. She continued, her tone measured. "There were times when I was told I wasn't ready, that I needed more experience, that my ideas weren't good enough." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "But talent doesn't need permission, and it doesn't need validation from the wrong people." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some people exchanged glances, understanding exactly what she meant. Others simply waited, drawn into the tension building between every carefully chosen word. He felt his pulse in his ears. She wasn't saying his name. She didn't have to. Her eyes met his again, just for a second. Then she turned back to the crowd. "This award isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who's been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated." She smiled, but there was something behind it, something only a few people in this room would understand. Because, in the end, the work speaks for itself. Applause thundered through the auditorium. People stood, clapping, cheering. She accepted the award with grace, posed for photos, and stepped off the stage. He stayed seated. He didn't want to leave yet, not with everything racing through his mind. The moment she disappeared behind the curtains, he exhaled. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. This wasn't just an award. This wasn't just another person getting recognition. This was proof that he had been wrong, and he never handled being wrong very well. The memory of her working under him surfaced in his mind. She had been dedicated, always the first to show up and the last to leave. She absorbed everything like a sponge, always asking the right questions, always pushing herself. He had assumed she was one of those people who would work hard forever without expecting much in return. The kind that made things easier for people like him. He had miscalculated. Now, as the event continued around him, he realized something unsettling. She wasn't just successful. She was in his way. The company he had built his career around, she had just secured a deal that would overshadow their biggest project. The clients who once trusted his judgment, some of them were now looking at her. The people he used to impress, they were whispering about her instead. She hadn't just risen. She was taking the space he once believed was his. And from the look on her face tonight, she knew it. As the event came to an end, he made his way toward the exit, keeping his expression neutral. People congratulated him in passing, some out of habit, some out of politeness. He nodded, responded when necessary, but his mind was elsewhere. Outside, the cool night air hit his face. He needed a moment. A drink. A distraction. Something to pull him out of the sinking feeling in his chest. That's when he heard her voice. "I was wondering if you'd leave without saying anything." He turned. She stood a few feet away, award in one hand, her other tucked casually into a pocket. There was no arrogance in her posture. No gloating. Just quiet confidence. He forced a smile. "Congratulations." She tilted her head slightly. "You almost sound like you mean that." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "I do. Success looks good on you." She studied him for a moment, then took a slow step closer. "It's funny, isn't it?" He raised an eyebrow. "What is?" Her gaze didn't waver. How people only see talent when they have no other choice. His stomach tightened. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. And from the way she looked at him, he knew she had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to see what he would do next. But he had a feeling she already knew. This wasn't over. He held her gaze for a moment longer, forcing himself to keep his expression unreadable. But something about the way she looked at him, like she had already figured him out, made his skin prickle. She didn't wait for a response. With a small nod, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the cool night air, his mind tangled in thoughts he didn't want to entertain. He should have been prepared for this. The moment her name started appearing in places that once belonged to him, he should have known their paths would cross again. But he had assumed he'd still hold the upper hand, that no matter how far she climbed, she'd always be a step behind. Now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Inside the event hall, people were still mingling, celebrating, making deals in hushed conversations over expensive champagne. It was the kind of environment where he used to thrive, but tonight it felt suffocating. The sound of her name was everywhere. He needed to get out of there. He slipped past the crowd, ignoring the meaningless small talk, the forced congratulations. His car was parked a few blocks away, but the walk didn't clear his mind the way he had hoped. If anything, it made things worse. Every step felt like a reminder of how much had changed. He had spent years building his reputation, climbing to the top, making sure he was always the one people turned to. He had played the game better than anyone. Connections, strategy, timing, he had mastered all of it. And now, she was rewriting the rules. The worst part? She had done it without him. He reached his car, yanked open the door, and sank into the driver's seat. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his mind racing. This wasn't just about an award. It wasn't just about recognition. She was a threat, not in the obvious, direct way. She wasn't out to ruin him, not intentionally anyway. But that's what made it worse. She didn't need revenge. She was winning simply by being better. And if he didn't do something soon, there wouldn't be anything left for him to hold on to. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on a familiar name. He hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The voice on the other end picked up almost immediately. "I need a meeting," he said, his tone clipped. "Tomorrow. First thing." A pause. Then, with who? His grip tightened on the phone. Everyone. Because if she thought she could outshine him, she was about to learn. He wasn't the kind of man to let that happen. The meeting was set for the next morning. He arrived early, his usual confidence now laced with something colder, sharper. He had spent the night going over every possible move, every angle he could use. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival. The conference room was already filling up when he walked in. His team people he had worked with for years, people who had built their careers under his leadership, sat waiting, their conversations hushed. They could sense something was shifting. He took his seat at the head of the table, fingers tapping against the surface as he surveyed the room. "Let's not waste time," he said, his voice steady. "We all know why we're here." Someone cleared their throat. "If this is about it is it?" He didn't need to say her name. They already knew. "She's gaining momentum," another voice admitted. "Her last move securing that contract, it's got people talking." As if he didn't already know. As if he hadn't spent the last 24 hours reading every article, every headline, every analysis breaking down exactly how she had pulled it off. He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then we stop her." Silence. A few uneasy glances exchanged around the room. "She's not playing dirty," someone finally said. "She's just winning." His jaw tightened. He knew that. That was the problem. Everything she had accomplished, she had done the right way. No shortcuts, no underhanded moves. She had let her work speak for itself, and people had listened. Which meant his usual strategies wouldn't work. That realization sat heavy in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. "Then we play smarter," he said. "Every person she's connected to, every opportunity she's chasing, we get there first." Someone hesitated. "She's not just some competition. She knows how we operate. If we make a move, she'll see it coming." His lips pressed into a thin line. That was true. She had been in this room before, sat at this very table, listened, learned. He had dismissed her then, never thinking she would one day be the one forcing them into defense. Now, she was making the rules. A thought flickered in the back of his mind. He hadn't wanted to consider it before, but now it felt like the only way. If he couldn't beat her outright, he had to find a way to pull her back into his orbit. "She can see our moves," he said finally, "because she knows how we think. But that also means she still thinks like us." He met their eyes, making sure they understood. "And that means she has weaknesses we can use." A heavier silence settled over the room. He wasn't talking about strategy anymore. He was talking about her. Because no matter how much she had changed, no matter how far she had come, he knew there had to be something that could break her. And he was going to find it. For the next few days, he worked in silence. Every move was calculated, every decision precise. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Winning wasn't about being the fastest. It was about knowing exactly when to strike. His team followed his orders without question. They reached out to her clients, made better offers, created doubts where there had been none before. They attended the same events, slipped into the same conversations, made sure people remembered who had built this industry first. At first, it seemed to work. A few deals stalled. Some partnerships hesitated. Small shifts, but noticeable ones. He waited for the cracks to spread, for the pressure to mount, for her to start losing ground. But she didn't. Instead, she adapted. Every time he tried to close a door, she found another way in. Where others would have panicked, she adjusted. Where people doubted her, she proved them wrong. And each time, she did it without playing dirty. It was infuriating. The way she carried herself, the way she refused to back down, it was as if she knew exactly what he was doing, as if she had expected it. And then it happened. One evening, he received a message. No name, no introduction. Just a simple line. "You always did underestimate me." His grip on the phone tightened. His pulse was steady, but something in his chest shifted, something he didn't like. She was calling him out. Not in public, not in front of anyone else. Just him. A challenge. For the first time, he hesitated. Did she know what he was planning? Had she already figured out his next move? Or worse, was she setting up one of her own? Before he could respond, another message came through. "If you're going to play, at least try to keep up." He exhaled sharply, a slow smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, despite the tension crawling up his spine. She wasn't just winning. She was toying with him. And that meant she had something he didn't. Information. Leverage. Or maybe something he hadn't seen coming. Something that could turn the entire game against him. He stared at the screen, the words lingering in his mind long after the notification faded. This wasn't just a response. It was a warning. A signal that she wasn't just keeping up, she was ahead. And he hated that. His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from her. It was one of his contacts. "We have a problem." His stomach tensed. He dialed immediately. What happened? A pause, then a sigh. She got there first. His fingers tightened around the phone. Where? The investors. The ones we were supposed to meet next week? She already pitched to them. His jaw clenched. And silence. Then they signed with her. The words landed like a blow, sharp and unforgiving. He had spent months cultivating that deal, positioning himself perfectly. And now, she had walked in and taken it, just like that. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. She had known, which meant someone had told her. His mind raced through the possibilities, the list of people who had access to that information. His team was loyal, at least, they had been. But something wasn't adding up. He needed answers. Now, he left his office, moving fast, his expression unreadable. By the time he reached the building's exit, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Who is this? A familiar voice. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. You already know. His grip tightened on the phone. You think this is funny? A small chuckle, low and amused. Not funny. Predictable. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. You had help. Did I? There was something in her tone, something knowing. And suddenly, it clicked. It wasn't his team. It was someone higher up. Someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to shift their loyalty. Someone who had seen the way the tides were turning and decided to bet on her instead. A move he should have seen coming. You played this well, he admitted, his voice tight. I didn't play, she corrected. I just stopped waiting. The words hit harder than he expected. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't rubbing it in. She was simply done. Done proving herself. Done fighting for a place at a table she had already outgrown. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't just a loss. This was the end. Not for her. For him. Because while he had been too focused on stopping her, he hadn't noticed the ground shifting beneath him. And now, it was too late. She had already won. He stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, but there was nothing left to say. She didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. That was the part that unsettled him the most. She wasn't interested in revenge. She had simply moved past him, past everything he had spent so much time trying to protect. The call ended without another word. He lowered the phone slowly, his grip loose now. A part of him had known this moment was coming, but he had never imagined it would feel like this, so quiet, so final. Inside the office, his team was waiting, or at least, what was left of it. People who had once hung on to his every decision were now second-guessing their loyalty. He could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided his gaze, the way their conversations hushed when he walked in. Someone had already started the exit process. He noticed a half-packed box on one of the desks, a subtle but clear sign. Others would follow soon. He had seen it happen before, just never to himself. He sat at his desk, staring at the emails piling up. Investors asking for updates. Partners reconsidering deals. A few messages from old contacts, pretending to check in, but really trying to figure out if he was still worth aligning with. He closed his laptop. He already knew the answer. The industry had moved on, and he wasn't at the center of it anymore. He left the office without a word. The streets were loud, but his mind was quiet in a way that unsettled him. He walked without direction, past familiar buildings, past places where deals had been made, where his name had once carried weight. Now, they were just buildings. It wasn't until he reached a quiet cafe on the corner that he stopped. The place was nearly empty. He ordered coffee, sat by the window, and stared at the world outside. For the first time in years, there was no plan, no next move waiting to be executed. He had spent so long trying to stay ahead that he had never considered what would happen if he lost. Not just lost became irrelevant. The thought lingered. But then, something else surfaced, something quieter. A question he had avoided for too long. What now? He exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the coffee cup. He had no answer. But maybe, for the first time in his life, that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe losing wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of something else. And for the first time, he was willing to find out.